Welcome to Gods and Monsters by E. E. King, read by me, E. E. King. Each week, MetaStellar releases a new episode of Gods and Monsters, both in print and on audio YouTube. Thank you for joining us. And now, part 3, Pamela. The story thus far. The fates weave together all the lives in this tale. Gabrielle, a human vampire hybrid who has the ability to make vampires forget time and stay up till dawn. When they turn to dust, he makes jewelry out of their rainbow crystal teeth. He sells these in a shop run by the Three Fates in San Francisco in the 1980s. The necklaces attract vampires and cause a slate of murders. River, who has a supernatural gift for baking sweets that induce happiness, and his crow Huck have followed Gabrielle to San Francisco. In a 24-hour diner, River falls in love with a red-haired waitress named Pamela. He discovers Thanatos, who he thought was a homeless old man, is actually the Greek god of death, who is taking blood from coma patients and delivering it to vampires with AIDS. He learns that Pamela is one such vampire. And now, part 3, History. Pamela. A daughter without her mother is a woman broken. It is a loss that settles deep into her bones. Christian Hannah. Chapter 30, Chapter 97, Pamela. San Francisco, 1848 to 1899. The beginning. People say that time is curved and space is relative, but ghosts live it, Ryo tells River. River doesn't hear him. He's deafened by the sound of sorrow roaring in his ears like a tide inside a seashell. Ryo sighs. It's like talking to Gabrielle, like calling into an echoless void. The disembodied are unstuck in time. I can see the past, but not change it. It's like watching a movie, or really, more like putting yourself in the stream from the camera. Images flow over me, but they can't hear. You might as well talk to light. Pictures pass by, untouchable and unchangeable as I am. Still, being freed of time allows me to follow threads. Pamela's is a long one. There are places that attract spirits, Ryo says. Native gods and monsters favor the Bay Area for millennia. When Europeans and Asians immigrated, they brought with them fairies, bogies, ghosts, banshees, vampires, and monsters. Old gods followed. Demons and deities need only a little belief to linger. They wander from era to epoch, fears made manifest across time and distance, transcending continents and centuries, as old as nightmares, as constant as death. Ryo's words hang in the air. River feels their weight, but cannot hear them or decipher their meaning. In the 1960s, workers who were building a subway under the Tenderloin found 2 pairs of sharp crystals that divided the sun into rainbows. Researchers attempted methods tried and true, experimental and established, but the crystals divide categorizing. I think your friend Jackson would have recognized them. Those particular crystals dated back to the late 1840s when the first vampires arrived in San Francisco. It was a wild time. From 1848 to 1849, San Francisco's population leapt from 800 to 50,000. The magic lure was gold. A fortunate few found nuggets in stream beds and became millionaires. Most were not so lucky. Life was brief and brutal. Lawlessness was a law. Blood was plentiful. It flowed as freely as the miners imagined gold would, gushing from the streams of humanity surging into the city. Vampires followed the deluge of fluid and fear, tracking the lonely, homeless, and lost to the city, drawn by the need for belief as well as blood. On their persons, most immigrants bore only bare necessities, but their hearts were full of myths and legends, tales sucked in with their mother's milk, belief built on their grandmother's stories. Spirits, gods, and demons need faith as surely as you need food or Huck needs peanuts. Huck caws softly. He can hear Ryo just fine. In fact, his sharp eyes can even see disturbances in the atmosphere when Ryo moves. But Huck is not afraid. Animals fear death, but not the dead. The dead, in fact, are a comfort and assurance of continuance. The city was and is a haven for vampires, Ryo continues. He wishes River could hear him, but even with only Huck for an audience, he enjoys talking. Ideas made audible have power. Giving voice to visions makes them real. The fog makes darkness linger, and there was and is so much available food. Then it was easy to pick off lone prospectors. Now it's mostly the homeless. San Francisco is a good place for vampires. Vampires need blood and belief. Werewolves are different. They crave solitude and meat. Back then, what werewolves there were usually preferred the country. No one wondered if the mauled remains of a lone prospector was discovered in the high mountains. It was 1847. The land was wild. Beasts roamed the hills. Bears, mountain lions, rattlers, all spelled danger for a lone man, and men, as usual, were their own worst enemies. One was much more likely to be killed over a disputed claim than end up as dinner. Ryo's weightless hand strokes Huck's glossy feathers. Huck closes his eyes and cocks his head sideways. Ryo tickles the underside of Huck's chin. Normally, River would have noticed the movement of hair over Huck's plumage, even though there was no wind. But today, he cannot see beyond his sorrow. Most lives have their heroes and villains. It's a pity that Pam's nemesis would turn out to be her mother. But perhaps that is one thing you have in common. Pamela's mother, Teresa, was born in 1869. At 15, when married, she was already a voluptuous 240 pounds woman. Her groom, Edward Wall, was a handsome, feckless fireman, more than twice her age, with a taste for large ladies and abundant alcohol. 2 years later, Teresa gave birth to a son, Joseph, as delicate as a snowflake. A baby so sweet, if you cut him, sugar would drip from his wounds. So loving, on foggy days, doves fluttered around him, warming him with downy feathers. When Teresa cradled Joseph in her arms, she didn't think about Edward's drinking. When she looked into his deep, bottomless blue eyes, she forgot their house was cold and dirty. When she sang to him, her voice, usually rough as sandpaper, rose purer than a lark's up to heaven. Ryo continues. He thinks that maybe his words will seep into River's mind and help him heal his pain with the invisible balm of understanding. He knows that eventually River will hear him again. It's just a matter of time, and Ryo has all the time there is. It's 1886. The sisters sit in the perpetual twilight at their back room. Nana's weaving an infant's jumper, blue as a forget-me-not. Decima has measured out 2 lengths of thread. One is strong, rough, fire engine red twine. Another short and insubstantial as good intentions. She holds both out to Asia, who with a grim smile severs the red twine with black-handled shears, sharp as scalpels. Decima begins measuring out yards of rosy yarn. I think you are almost done with this jumper, Nana, Asia asks, pulling from her apron a child's blue-handled scissors. Nana nods. Decima is still uncoiling rows of rose blue, indigo, and red yarn. That's very long, says Asia. Oh, yes, Nana says. You should see the pattern. This cloth could furnish a whole wardrobe. Edward's incendiary combination of occupation and affinity ends abruptly. A fireman who drops his flask in a burning building blazes his path to his own destruction, Ryo says. Joseph, fragile as he is sweet, lingers only a few months before following Edward to the grave. Teresa, pregnant with Pamela, determines that this child will live, though even she could never guess how long. Yet Pamela gives Teresa more sorrow than joy. When she looks at Pamela's round, rosy face and ruddy cheeks, she yearns for Joseph's slender and fair countenance. If Joseph had lived, she thinks, he would have been walking. Butterflies would have clustered round him, making a winged garden of the dirty San Francisco streets. Flowers would have sprouted from the cold, dry mortar of the lifeless brick. He would have been talking, voice melodious as a songbird's. Teresa works and saves money like dreams, each penny building a life for Pamela. Pamela is darling. She is sweet as honey, but she is not Joseph. She is Teresa's motivation, but never her being. Teresa's blonde waves and lush curves get her work in a dance hall. Champagne flows like wine, and Teresa likes champagne. I'm going back a long ways, I know, but sometimes it's a long journey backward to understanding and acceptance. In 5 years, Teresa saves enough to buy a 2-story wooden building in the Tenderloin. In 1898, the Tenderloin is an elegant neighborhood right in the heart of San Francisco. From here, Teresa can touch the pulse of the city, hear its breath, feel its life. She turns her building into a boarding house for young ladies. Her house usually contains 10 or 15 girls, all of them young, none of them ladies. Teresa favors large, curvaceous blondes who resemble her. The single brunette or sole redhead in the parlor stands out as flamboyant and exotic as an orchid in a field of daisies. I love this era of San Francisco, as colorful as the Victorian painted ladies that line the streets of the city. Not the best time to be alive, perhaps, but wonderful to watch. Teresa furnishes her house with antiques and lavish velvet draperies fringed with gold. She dresses herself and her gals in the latest fashion, draping herself in jewels, attempting to procure contentment from cold gems. Teresa and her girls live in luxury, while Pamela is relegated to the attic with Sally and Margarita. Sally and Margarita are twins, tall girls with skin smooth and black as obsidian. Margarita is the housemaid. It's her duty to usher men to the parlor or to await Madame Wall. Sally is Pamela's nurse and nanny, her alpha and omega, her mother and father. Ryo pauses. He puts a hand on River's shoulders, wishing he possessed the weight and substance to hold River tight. River shrugs, feeling a breeze on his shoulder, but he too is too sunk in memory to notice that there is no wind stirring the leaves on the trees or blowing stray papers through the streets. It's a kind of anomaly any good naturalist should note, the type that Ryan has taught him to observe. Ryo wonders if understanding the past makes the present more palatable, if knowledge breeds forgiveness. Sally loves Pamela with a fierceness born of frustration and pain. Into her, Sally pours all her hopes and dreams of a different, a better life. She makes it her duty to educate Pam. It's Pamela's great good fortune that Sally is literate, fluent in both English and French, schooled at an early age by her mother. Sally was that rare being in 19th century, an American Black who has never known slavery. Buried deep in her family's history, where fact and fiction mingle and interbreed, lay a tale. Sally and Margarita's great-grandmother, a Sally too, had been mistress to a wealthy American. He was famous, so famous that at the mention of his name, small children were silent. Trees bent their trunks, and even cats, those most arrogant of creatures, stopped licking their paws and paid attention. He was more brilliant than the stars and sharper than an axe. Word flowed from his pen that soothed the troubled waters of a new country. And of all the women in the world, he loved Sally's great-great-grandmother best, though he never set her free. Perhaps, Pamela thought, it was because he loved her so much. Maybe he was afraid she would leave him. Pamela wishes that Teresa loved her even one half so much, even a quarter. She would gladly have been Teresa's slave if her mother would love her. But not Sally. Sally is proud of her ancestry, not of the famous white man buried in her genes, but of her mother and grandmother who kept the gifts of literature and knowledge alive within her. She scorns any man who caged what he loved, no matter the motive or the enclosure. You preach a better sermon with deeds than discourse, Sally tells Pam. Sally treasures her legacy of learning. She tries to obtain suitable literature, but also smuggles up newspapers, novellas, and discarded love notes, figuring that any prose is better than none. It's an odd and interesting, if not a well-rounded education. After all, Pamela has many, many more years before her in which to read, far more than anyone suspects. Thank you for joining us. Join us next week when the great earthquake of 1906. It's one of those brief windows in history when tragedy unites, not divides. They never last long, these brief moments of connection. I don't know why. I suppose I never shall. It's only the dead who no longer fight. Thanks for joining. See you next week. Bye-bye.